Our first panel for today is primary and secondary education. Where do we go from here to improve educational outcomes? Please welcome our panelists and please come forward as I call your names. Boris Belayev, the co-founder and executive director of Educate. Dmitry Holtzman, the executive director of Equal Education Law Center. Jordan Wells, the chief program officer for Shining Hope for Communities. Ati Warku, the founder and executive director of Seeds of Africa. And we are awaiting the arrival of Mr. Ken Dunkak, co-founder and CEO Omega Schools. And last but not least, our moderator, Liz Berry Gibbs, the executive chair, African Leadership Foundation.
Well, good morning. Is the mic working okay? Great, great. It's wonderful to be here this morning. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel, and thank you in advance to the panelists. I'm delighted to moderate this conversation for the next hour because this is obviously a fascinating and really important question, the question of where we go from here. I think everybody in this room, everybody who works in education knows that we've made enormous strides over the last decade or so in terms of increasing access. We have far greater numbers of children in school than ever before. We have many who are still trying to get into school, but I think the core challenge that we all face now is how do we improve the quality of that education. This is a big topic that people work on full time. There's clearly no silver bullet answer. It's a very nuanced problem. It's a problem that we're challenged with here in the United States and frankly in every country around the world. I think to have a chance for the next hour to kind of probe this question in Africa with 4 people, hopefully 5, who are practitioners, who are working hard on this from different perspectives, day in and day out, will be a wonderful opportunity. And we look forward to your questions as well, audience. And I think one of the wonderful things about this panel, Boris and I have chatted about this a little bit, is that we have a real diversity of approaches represented here. I'm going to give each panelist an opportunity to describe their organization a little bit in more detail, but Boris, to my left here, is working in Uganda on a program called Educate that's really working at scale. Dimitri, with Equal Education, your approach is around advocacy. Jordan, working with Shining Hope for Communities, has very much of a community-based model, working primarily at the primary level. And Ati, working in Ethiopia, also has more of a school and community-based model. So I think the opportunity to kind of compare and contrast various aspects of this challenge, knowing that you each really look at this through a different lens, will be terrific. And I personally feel very fortunate that I've had a chance to see many of your terrific models in action. So I know just how fortunate we are to have all of you here today. So with that, let me just begin with the obvious first question, which is, can each of you start by describing a little bit about your program, about your model, so we all have a basic understanding. But then, even more so, tell us what you think differentiates your model in terms of your model's impact on outcomes, because you clearly are all impacting outcomes for students. So what do you think it is that differentiates your approach? Boris, I'll start with you.
Sure, thank you, and it's an honor to be here. So Educate works our goal is to create the future of secondary education, so that directly as a result of school, youth can bring themselves out of poverty, and so that the education systems in sub-Saharan Africa can develop the leaders and entrepreneurs who can drive development. So we want to create the most practical, skills-based model of education so that it leads directly to young people being able to take leadership initiative, start a business, and ultimately improve their livelihoods. Our model has 3 parts. First, we work to empower youth by providing entrepreneurship and leadership training, mentorship, and experience starting a business. Second, we train teachers. And third, we advocate for systems-level reform to bring a much more practical, experience-based education to all secondary school students. We've seen a 160% average income increase in our graduates and a 64% increase in percent with a business. In 2012, we got a majority of our curriculum into Uganda's national entrepreneurship curriculum, as well as our student business club and we were able to change the exam to evaluate what students do in the business club. And this year, we scaled up from 54 to 240 schools, so working with about 25,000 students. And our lofty vision is to work in 10 years with 1 million students across 10 countries, and we want to work directly in 4 and try to support policy level change in 6. I think what differentiates us is kind of 3 things. First, and this is kind of, I wish this didn't differentiate us, but we don't really see anyone working with youth to try to integrate such a model into an education system. We see a lot of out-of-school youth work and even in-school work that doesn't really engage the system. And so a big differentiator for us is that we want what we do to be what the education system does, and we try to work as collaboratively as we can with the education system, starting in Uganda. 2, unfortunately, I think because of the donor environment, there's a lot of kind of mission drift. And for us, we're really focused specifically on the mismatch between education and life after school at secondary. And we're trying to build the most repeatable, scalable model to do that. And we don't do anything else. And if funders came and asked us to work with out-of-school youth, we don't do that. And so, which kind of, to me, is the definition of social enterprise. And third, we measure and manage to impact very aggressively. So we're running one of the first randomized control trials on kind of quality in secondary education in sub-Saharan Africa, at least that we've seen. We have a weekly dashboard that shows us attendance and how many girls, how many boys came to our class every week, which we can manage against. We've built tools to capture life outcomes because we want education to lead directly to students being able to get out of poverty, to be able to start businesses, and we hold ourselves accountable to that.
Great. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Liz, and also to the organizers for inviting me to this, what I hope to be quite an interesting day. To describe what the Equal Education Law Center does, I think is important to situate in the kind of historical context of South Africa, which is where we're working. Our offices are based in Cape Town in South Africa. And I'm representing the Equal Education Law Center today, which is, as Liz was saying, an advocacy and, in fact, strategic litigation organization that looks to bring litigation and advocacy against both state actors, schools, as well as private individuals involved in providing public education, with the purpose of bringing about more accountability in the kind of broader project of advancing and improving education in South Africa. I say it's important to put our work in the context of the kind of historical nature of education and, in fact, Bantu education in South Africa. Coming from a long history of purposefully and legalized disproportional provision of public education resources, skewed markedly against African and black learners in South Africa, which is still a very key feature of the public education system in South Africa today. So based, in fact, on what was said in the introductory remarks about education being a public good, our main focus is to focus on what the state's responsibilities are in fulfilling that public good, and in fact in ensuring that the fundamental human right to education is in fact realized and accessible to those that need it the most, which in South Africa today is in fact the majority of the black population who are poor and living in rural and township areas. The reason I say that it's important to speak about the Law Center, which is actually quite a relatively new organization focusing specifically on the kind of legal elements of the work that we do, is because it comes after the more important, I would say, more important organization, kind of umbrella organization, which is Equal Education. So Equal Education, which is separate from us, but which is our sister organization and key partner, does a very different kind of work, which we as the legal team support. So Equal Education's mission is really to, as the name suggests, look at identifying what the key issues that perpetuate inequality and poor quality in the public education system in South Africa, which I would say would be the key and fundamental characteristics of public education in the country. And Equal Education's been involved in the project of building a social movement based in community organizing, and which is primarily looking at youth community organizing but also including parents and teachers, in trying to bring about a system of greater accountability in the way in which the state actually provides for public education. I'd say that actually the combination of the strategic litigation and legal advocacy work that we do in support of the social movement is in fact what is one of the things that makes our project, I think, unique and somewhat different. But I say different in the education-specific context because we also draw our tactics, our strategies from other social movements which have been developed and been quite successful in South Africa under our very progressive constitutional order in other areas like health and housing, for example. So some of the key projects and campaign work that we've been doing, because that's again one of the strategies that we use, is to identify specific problems that can be then addressed through community organizing, through specifically targeted campaigns that ultimately try and compel specific government action to address particular issues. Some of those key campaigns that have been run to date have been around, specifically around looking at literacy in schools. So trying to, one of our first major campaigns was actually addressing the fact that there was a lack in government policy around school libraries, which was an irony given the fact that we, despite spending so much in education relative to, in fact, many developing countries, still perform very poorly in international literacy tests particularly, while at the same time having a stark statistic like 93% of schools in the country not having any access to functioning school libraries. Government hadn't in fact developed a policy around that to even address the problem, and so that was one of the key campaigns that Equal Education has taken on through social mobilization since then. Linked to that has been a school infrastructure campaign, and again that's been to address the fact that there hasn't yet been, in fact, up until very recently, and as a success of our campaign work, there wasn't in fact a law which stipulated what the basic school infrastructure conditions for any school in the country should actually be. And that's been an ongoing project which in some ways looks at what some of the basics, provision of resources should be to even start to speak about a conducive, or even further down the line, a high quality education system. So I can speak a bit more about that, but I think I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Dimitri.
Thank you for this opportunity. I'm excited to talk about SHOFCO's work. Shining Hope for Communities, we call it SHOFCO because Shining Hope for Communities is a bit of a mouthful. So when I say SHOFCO, that's what I'm referring to. Our model places free schools for girls at the center of a holistic approach. So we provide healthcare, economic empowerment programs, adult education, water and sanitation. We're working in the urban slums of Kenya. Our first site is in Kibera, which is the largest slum in Kenya and one of the largest in the world. The organization was started by Kennedy Odede, who's from Kibera, and girls' education was very important to him, and he saw that as a central, gender equality and girls' education as a key to transforming his community. What's different about our model is the holistic approach. We're looking with the girls, we're investing in the brightest girls with the highest need, and we see them as the future leaders that can come back and further transform their communities and the country. With our wraparound services, we're looking for to change the communities now, and to get the buy-in and investment of the community. And having been started and led by somebody from the community, it's a very community-led approach. So we've adapted our approach as the community has given feedback and expressed different needs. We have just expanded into our second site in Mathare, and that came from, we have a youth newspaper called the Ghetto Mirror, and youth from the Mathare slum had read it and came and said, we'd love to have this in our community. So it's a very organic and grassroots growth and approach, which I think sets us apart.
Great. Thanks, Jordan. Nati.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Amini, for having me here. It's a real pleasure. What at Seeds of Africa, what we focus on is looking at how do we fight poverty, and we believe that education is one of the key components that communities can use as a tool to fight poverty. And in looking at that, we've spent the last about 5 years developing a model that combines education and community development to find a more holistic and comprehensive way of dealing with issues of poverty. One of the ways we do that is really focusing on providing curriculum and developing curriculum that really takes the child as the center of the learning environment. So looking at, how do you solve local problems, how you solve local problems is really engaging children in making sure that they understand how to solve issues from a very young age. We start with pre-K, and currently we have a pre-K and primary school in my hometown, Adama, in Ethiopia, with a vision to expand into other communities within Ethiopia and abroad in other African countries. And we do believe that when you engage children and allow them to solve issues that they face every day, then they grow up to be adults who can also solve issues that they face in their environments. And by doing so, you can really find a way where local issues can be solved locally. And we strongly believe that we Africans have the capacity and ability to solve issues that we face if we really equip our children and educate them in ways that are life-changing. And the other thing that I think makes us unique is really looking at how you improve the quality of education. There's a lot of challenge in Africa where we focus on quantity and access and not spend enough time looking at, what actually happens within the four walls of a classroom. And are children learning? What are they learning? And how are they learning? And that's where we focus in making sure that our teachers have the resources and training to provide education that really is important for the children, but also making sure that our teachers have the freedom to take a curriculum and deliver it in a way that is really important for the child.
Thanks, Auntie. Thank you guys all so much for those great overviews. Auntie, picking up on your last point about your approach to curriculum and working with teachers, I'd love to probe that a little bit more with each of you, because we all know that to improve outcomes, we need to work with teachers, and we need to think differently about curriculum. And I think, actually, maybe Boris, starting with you again, those are two key components of your model: working with teachers and a very different curriculum. So if you could just touch on how you do both of those, and then any thoughts in general about looking system-wide, what you think we should be thinking about in terms of teacher training and curriculum changes.
That's a great question.
Big one, too.
Sorry.
A
big one. I'll actually answer the second piece first, just because we think it's the driver. And so for us, I mean, we're all incentive-driven people, and the challenge for teachers is that they're driven by the incentives of the education system. And at least in Uganda, it's very exam-driven. And so, I mean, I think we see this problem in the U.S., yes, although not to as great as extent as we do in sub-Saharan Africa. And for us, the biggest thing is how do we change incentives of the education system so that they can better support teachers teaching in more student-centered ways. So as an example, sort of a big first step, but still sort of a smaller step in the grand scheme, when we got our student business club into the national entrepreneurship curriculum, and when we changed the exam, now teachers were much more incentivized to support students to start businesses. There was an article that said 45% of schools have business clubs, and I was having lunch in July with the Minister of Higher Education. He said, at one of my schools, students are starting businesses now, and so I think I think there's definitely behavior change that teachers can do, but I think the bigger thing is how do you change the incentives of what they're supposed to do, because it's difficult to get people to get a majority of people to do so much work outside of what they're incentivized to do. When thinking about kind of changing their behavior on site, we partner with an organization called STIR, which has a great methodology for engaging teacher-led innovations and motivating teachers by kind of showing them that they can be agents of change. We also try to piggyback on interests of teachers. So when we first tried working with teachers, we picked specific teachers in sort of entrepreneurship and economics, and it was tough to get them motivated. the second year around, we made it a fellowship where it was a professional development opportunity geared around their interests. And so we had a student business club, a student business fellow, who teachers were learned how to support student business clubs and student businesses, and in the process were able to start their own businesses, because at least in Uganda, most teachers are looking for additional income. So I guess to recap, I think everything starts with the system, and once you can make that system change, then you have a lot more ability to leverage the interests and the sort of self-motivation of the teacher to get them to become better.
Yeah. Let me just interject a quick follow-up question there, because I'm sure many people in the audience who are working with programs wonder how you as an organization got to that place where you could influence the systemic change.
That's a good question. I think it was a combination of having some early success and being at the right place at the right time. So in 2010, the Ugandan National Curriculum Development Center was working with the International Labor Organization to revamp the upper secondary entrepreneurship curriculum. And so we were able to advocate to get multiple sort of actors not to see our program. We had some initial evidence, and we were able to get involved in that process. And kind of it was a long process, but in the end we got a lot. I think a big lesson for us is to piggyback on existing reform movements.
Yep.
So I think it's going to be very difficult to affect change, kind of starting from zero, particularly because ministries are so under-resourced. So as we think about expansion and moving outside of Uganda, the first thing we're looking for, where is there existing secondary school reform that is moving towards a more student-centered, practical, experience-based education, and how can we sort of support that process?
Great. Dimitri, I know you have a different approach of working with the teachers and the unions. We'd love to hear about that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I was going to say I'd feel less competent to speak about what the kind of curriculum development aspects of improving education would be, rather than the way in which teachers engage with the curriculum and are actually able to cover that, and also the approach to unions. I'd say it's always a bit of a challenge coming to the United States, speaking about the role of unions, and I know that it's, as it is in South Africa, a highly politicized issue. Which I think is different. It's difficult to sometimes straddle between the kind of labor-related issues and what the education outcomes are, which I think tends to be where some of the difficulties in the debate lies. I'd say what's different to our, or maybe it's not different. I'm not exactly sure what the audience is that I'm speaking to, but I would say that our approach to unions in South Africa particularly is that we are supportive of the role and the need for unions in the education system, and in fact feel that an effective union which is able to, I think, transgress the narrow labor interests of teachers as a unionized force into looking at how that also affects the education outcomes and improvement in education. We support the existence of unions. We support the need to, in fact, hold unions accountable to those education outcomes as well. But we also have our own problems with very powerful unions sometimes being quite obstructive to propose progress in education. I would say, without getting stuck in the question of unions or not, or what the role of the unions are, I'd like to actually perhaps focus on the issue of what makes a conducive teaching and learning environment, which I think speaks much more directly to the role that teachers can actually play in the classroom environment as individuals there, excuse me, rather than as members of a bigger labor organization. As I was saying earlier on, one of our key focus areas has in fact been on focusing on ensuring that the state makes sure there is sufficient provision of both physical infrastructure in the way in which the school environment actually looks and feels, as well as the resources made available to teachers in order to be able to be effective in the teaching and learning environment. In South Africa, we've got major problems where even some of the most basic resources that you would require, including things like water, electricity, even proper classroom structures, we've still got hundreds of schools in South Africa in which kids are being taught in mud huts. And yet, when you take the teacher who's teaching in that environment, who's expected to perform in the same way and have the same kind of outcomes as a teacher in a more urban or even just in a township area, who in essence is working under difficult labor conditions, which are not then conducive and supportive to what it is that they achieve, those same teachers get painted with the same brush as being part of the problem in not improving education. So I would say that one key area, in fact, and I would think that the same applies to many other African countries or developing countries across the world where basic resources and school infrastructure is not effective, is in fact an important area. Of course, then ensuring that there is sufficient in-service training models that are provided by the state and that can upskill teachers who are in the system, I think, are obviously very crucial. And then something which I think has been quite, not innovative, I say, but has been a new development in South Africa, and which has gone some way to improving the way in which teachers are actually able to cover the curriculum, even under these very difficult circumstances, has been the provision of what the Education Department calls workbooks, which are in essence, and again, I'm noting this while understanding the challenges with standardizing the way in which you teach and test, for example, but ensuring that teachers are actually assisted through additional materials that ensure that they are actually able to cover the curriculum more speedily and comprehensively throughout the year, which I think is something that is starting to show positive developments in terms of outcomes, and again, most importantly, at the kind of bottom rung of the education system, right, where you are talking about learners from poor socioeconomic circumstances, and where those kinds of materials, I think, are most beneficial. Yeah, I mean, I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you.
We see that our main site is kind of our test site in terms of developing the curriculum and figuring out the best model for scale. We've only added one grade per year, so we could develop the curriculum and develop the teachers. So, and the curriculum development has definitely been a collaborative process in terms of the teachers that we've hired. And now at this point we have teacher trainers. So opening our second site, they're training all of the new teachers. Our curriculum is very different than the Kenya curriculum. Similarly to Uganda, it's very exam-based, very focused on memorization. And we have a very interactive, student-centered curriculum that's really working to develop critical thinking skills, which I think is core to our approach. So I think that the teacher, one of the things that we realized is when we had teachers come in is that they were very excited about this different approach, but they didn't know how to execute it. So we've really worked to develop a training program that starts where the teachers are, with having gone through the Kenyan system, having been trained in the Kenyan system, and realizing that they're not going to do a full 180, but how do you incorporate, what they've been taught and, the kind of strong parts of the Kenyan system and add on to that, right, and further develop that. So that's something where we see where we potentially can scale, because there's been a huge influx, particularly in Kibera, and in a lot of the slum areas. There's not anywhere near enough kind of public school infrastructure. So in that gap has a lot of private schools and formal schools have developed, and there's very little regulation, and they really vary significantly in terms of quality. So that we see that as a potential opportunity, both for us and for the government in terms of kind of public-private partnerships. Is how do you bring these schools came about to fill a gap, but the quality is varies and could really benefit from additional resources in terms of training. So that's something where we see there's the potential to scale our model and take what we've learned and apply it. But I think that teacher training is a huge piece.
Thank you. You actually jumped to my next question for you, which was like, and for Ati as well. I'd love for you to answer both the question about your approach to teachers and curriculum, but also for both of you, you have these fabulous models that are working in communities. So how do we take elements of that? Have you thought about how to take elements of your model and scale?
I'll start with the first
Yeah.
one, I think. When you look at how we engage our teachers in our curriculum, we basically take the government mandated curriculum and we change the delivery. So we allow for teachers to have ways to collaborate, to look at, not just if you have math and science, not just how you teach math and science separately, but how do you integrate it together so that a child can learn in a way that is more engaging and less intimidating. So in order for that to happen, what we do is we make sure that teachers have the ability, one, to collaborate in putting together the curriculum delivery. Two, it is to have autonomy to deliver their lessons in the way they think fits their classroom. Because as each country is different, even each classroom is different, and each student is different. We expect both our students and teachers to be researchers and to work collaboratively, and not in a way where the teacher has authority and the student just has to sit and listen to the teacher. Another thing we do is the support we provide to our teachers in the training, and all of these are the baseline things we do. And then we also try to do things above and beyond, where we incentivize our teachers financially. We also incentivize them in ways where, for example, currently we're working on sending a few of our teachers to Reggio Emilia in Italy to get training from the program that we've been inspired by. And we believe that by doing these things and also keeping, for example, our classroom size is very small, a teacher is actually incentivized just by finding out that they're making a change in a student's life. They see that children are learning well and they're learning better, and that definitely makes for a better teaching and learning environment. And in terms of how we deal with the community, really look at when you think of, coming out of poverty is very difficult. So when you think of trying to use education as a way to fight poverty, you have to look at things outside of the classroom. What are the other challenges that a child has? Do they have issues at home? How do you, look at, for example, our community development program works on improving household income of the families, because if you don't really engage the family, it's very difficult to expect that a child can just really do great in school and that's the end of your program. So that's really where we try to look at, the things that have to be done beyond the classroom that really impact learning within the classroom.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Ati, sticking with you for a moment, and then from our other panelists as well, what's the biggest obstacle you face in your work when it comes to improving outcomes?
I think one of the biggest obstacles we face is really the complexity of the issues that a child has when they come from a very poor and difficult background. So, you want to focus on education, but you realize that you can't just say, I'm going to focus on what happens in the school. So it's really trying to engage with families and provide or find ways to collaborate with other organizations to see what else needs to be done within a child's family.
Right.
But at the same time, trying to limit, how far you go into the other side, where we have our community development program, and we do work with families, but you also have to kind of find that balance between going outside of the classroom, but also kind of keeping your focus within the education and the other programs that we have.
Jordan, how about for Shining Hope? What comes to mind as your biggest obstacle?
I would say it's something very similar. In terms of the girls are facing so many challenges outside of school. And one of the things that the school is free, and in exchange the parents need to work 5 weeks out of the year. And that's allowed us an opportunity to really engage the parents in parenting workshops, and they also get them engaged in our economic programs so that we can try to increase the kind of outcomes of the entire family and provide a more supportive environment for the girls. But it's a struggle, and I think we have a very high rate of continuance, but sometimes the parents just can't afford to live in the city anymore, and they have to leave. So those are kind of very, very kind of clear everyday struggles that we try to address, but can be difficult.
Excuse me. Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree off the bat. The complexity of what it means to provide public education of a high quality on an equitable basis is massive, and I think it applies even more particularly in the litigation aspect, where we're talking about continuously trying to define what the right to education means, what the relevant state obligations and responsibilities towards that are. And then while looking at this kind of, problem where you've got kind of water pouring out of all areas of the sieve, trying to block it at different ways, and at the same time trying to ensure, and I think this is something that even relates specifically to developing a social movement in that, which I think is quite important in we're trying to engage otherwise disenfranchised and marginalized communities in what is quite widely accepted as the key way in which to address these issues of poverty is through education. And yet you want to ensure that there is some kind of momentum, that you see some kind of progress, and yet the problems are so far and wide, it becomes very difficult to sustain community involvement and even kind of a hope in some kind of sense of improvement. So I'd say that that's it. Is how do you develop effective strategies that don't also look for short-term solutions, and often having to make very difficult choices as to how you as advocates in the field choose to allocate your resources, when knowing that while you might fix one problem in one particular area, there will still be many. And if I can just say one more thing about that, I was actually hoping that Ken would be here for this discussion, because I've read with some interest the Omega model that's been developed in Ghana. And while I think that's also a very interesting area in which education reform has begun to develop, and looking at the way in which private sector can get involved in education. And I think there also it's a very, very complex issue. I think it's a complex issue which, because of the failings of the public education system, have allowed for the creation of a kind of market around education, which I think can have its short-term benefits on a much more individual level in realizing the right to education of specific individuals through private investment in education, through development of business models in there, which can, in the beginning and in the short term, look like a good and positive development, but in the long run can have quite drastic consequences and effects on the public education system, which I think just goes to this issue of looking at the complexity and what that means for short-term versus long-term goals. So I'm hoping he actually gets to join us before the end.
I agree. That's a fascinating question. Again, it's another one of those questions that we're also wrestling with here. Biggest obstacle?
I think, as I kind of mentioned, I think biggest obstacle is the exam and the incentives of the education system. We actually we asked schools to contribute $200 to our program this year, which has helped, but we've always struggled in schools fighting for time on the timetable, so getting time to work with students, just because there's such a focus on exams. Schools are evaluated on exams. Parents care about exams. The exams evaluate things that aren't necessarily relevant to life after school. And then maybe a secondary thing is just inertia. So if you've been taught in a rote memorization-based way, and your teachers were taught in a rote memorization-based way, and you've never seen anything else, it's tough to conceptualize that teaching can be something else, that the educational experience can be something different. And I think for us, we call our teachers mentors, just so we disconnect the association with kind of how teaching is, just because then we have some more freedom at least to bring a different conception of what a teacher is, what the teacher's role is. The teacher's job is to ask questions rather than just deliver content.
Great. I should borrow this for a second. Sure. I'd love to. I have a feeling your answer to this question will be tied up with the response you just gave us, but love to ask all of you, because I think we all of us feel the same way, that this is an incredibly complicated set of challenges that are interrelated. But if each of us found ourselves sitting in the seat of the Minister of Education for a moment, I know that's what Dimitri thinks a lot about, but you're welcome. In your respective countries, and you had to make one change, aside from just sort of pouring boatloads more money into the system. Let's sort of take that one off the table. What's the one thing you would want to change? And again, we might have teed that up for you already, but go ahead.
Yeah,
Laura.
and I'm actually I'm not the in-house education expert, so for us to be changing assessment, and so moving towards portfolio-based assessment, where it's a sort of portfolio of things that you've done and actions. So we have something called a leadership passbook, where it has a bunch of different actions of leadership in different areas, ethical leadership, community problem solving, that actions that students can actually take. And so to finish our course, they have to take a certain number of actions against problems in their community. And so if I could change one thing, it'd be moving towards that type of assessment that assesses action and doing.
Great.
Because then you're incentivizing teachers to support that action, support that doing. And our fundamental idea is that if you're going to have to start a business after school, since 90% of African youth are going to work in the informal sector, you should be starting a business in school. You should have a safe environment to do that. And consequently, you should be examined on your movement along that, towards that.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks.
Honestly, I don't dream about becoming the Minister of Education at all. In fact, the first thing I'd do is make sure I have some psychological support, because it's a very difficult task for anybody. I think what I would suggest would incorporate a bit of what was just said. I would think that, without having millions of dollars to just throw into the education system, if there was a particular strategy that I would develop, I think I would look specifically at, in fact, management training, especially for senior management people, including principals and senior management teams at schools. In that way, I think that you start to, you can find ways in which you can even make better and more efficient use of even limited resources that are available to you. I don't want to be mistaken for saying, and it's something that does get said in South Africa often, is that, well, if you just make sure that you've got a good principal in a school, it doesn't matter what your school looks like, you can teach it under a tree and have good outcomes. I think that's the very extreme opposite of what I'm saying. But we find that in many instances, in South Africa at least, even where there are adequate resources available, even where there are teachers that are energized, that are ready to make a difference, where those resources in a schooling environment isn't properly managed, where there isn't sufficient communication from a management level between the school and the broader community, for example, that facilitates that kind of involvement, or even the ability to bring out the best in teachers in the way in which the school is managed and structured, you can find very good and high levels of resources going to waste, and in fact, again, affecting poor outcomes. So among many other things that I think are still necessary, that would be something that I would suggest focusing on.
It's hard to choose one, but I think that the curriculum would probably be the first in terms of having it be much more experienced critical thinking and less teaching kind of to the exam. But I think that is a huge task, and there's been lots of conversations in Kenya about doing that and kind of making it more practical. But I think if that's not possible, would be some of what you're talking about in terms of delivery. If you can't, while addressing some of the curriculum issues, minimum addressing how it's delivered and how it's taught. And I think there are ways to make the curriculum more interactive if you focus on teacher training.
Great.
I think for me would be, particularly when you look at Ethiopia, our education policy is pretty good. It's the implementation where we struggle. So I would really focus on implementation. The Ethiopian policy really focuses on, the policy talks about making sure that quality is increased and making sure that children are learning better, but implementation is where we're lacking. So I would focus on improving implementation through whether that is providing better teacher training or better ways to assess progress. Particularly, for example, with SEEDS, we assess progress both qualitatively and quantitatively. That way you're not only looking at test scores like Boris and Dimitri were saying, but also you look at how is a student progressing in other areas that are really important. When you're thinking of using education as a tool to fight poverty and looking at leadership, you have to look at critical thinking skills and ability of children to be creative and being able to solve their issues. So I think those are, I mean, it's a tough job to be a Minister of Education, but those are,
absolutely.
and especially with very little funding that
Right.
most African countries struggle with, but those are the things I'd focus on.
Thank you, thank you. Well, let's just shift gears a little bit because we've talked a lot about your models and the challenges that you face, your approaches, the challenges you face, and sort of the challenges writ large. But you guys are all have fantastic examples of real promise, I think, real potential to change systems. So I'd love to hear from each of your perspectives what you see as sort of the bright spots out there, either trends that you see as really promising that we should continue to devote time, energy, and resources to, or even organizations that you might like to mention to the audience.
I think for me, there seems to be a shift towards skills-based education in secondary. So Uganda's done it at sort of upper secondary entrepreneurship. They're going through a big overhaul towards skills-based reform in lower secondary right now. And then there's the intention to make a skills-based curriculum sort of the intention. It comes down to the implementation of how does it get implemented, and kind of is there the funding there to do it right. But it seems, and I've heard that Uganda is the first, and we're right now exploring where else there is secondary reform like this. But to me, that is a really promising trend. There's a move towards more practical education where you come out with real skills that you can apply after. That it's thought about at a systems level. And that it's, I think there is growing recognition of the youth bowl. It's a growing recognition that I think there's all these kind of crazy stats about what African youth population will look like in 2050. I think there's growing recognition of it, and I think it's a really promising trend that education is moving towards addressing that.
Great.
Excuse me. I mean, I'd actually say, and I can say this now because I'm at a separate organization, but I must say that I am continually inspired by the work of Equal Education and the young people particularly that are driving that movement. If I had to mention a different organization, in fact, where I know that Equal Education's roots stem from, and a lot of its model in community organizing, in research and activism have come from, is in fact from an organization in Tanzania called Haki Elimu, which the models of which have been quite effective in bringing about education reform, although not very drastic, but impressive nonetheless, and particularly through a model which is based primarily on a strong research basis, but also community involvement in education directly at school, but also in government level, both from the highest levels of the way in which government budgets are actually developed and the engagement with parliament, etc., all the way down to a school level. But like I say, I do think that equal education itself, which is there's thousands of learners that are meeting every week that are discussing education policy related issues, and that are then on the basis of that actually bringing about a really strong force which is holding the government accountable to making sure that education is high on the agenda and that they are constantly pressured to make improvements which these learners themselves are actually pushing. So I get inspired by high school learners every day.
Great.
I think that the conversation for a long time is really focused on access and not as much on quality. And I think that there is starting to be a shift in terms of realizing providing access without quality it has serious drawbacks. So I think that's a bright spot. I also think that with us focusing on girls' education, there still is a gender gap, but we're seeing that closing, which I think is also very promising. And also, even just in the data that we collect, the attitudes around girls' education are changing. There's people in the community that we work in. 98% think it's equally important to educate girls and boys.
Great to hear. Ati?
I think a couple of things. One is the understanding from governments that they need to change their policies or their implementation. For example, in Ethiopia, the Ministry of Education really understands that they focused on, like she said, more on access, and now they're really trying to focus on quality. So I think that's one. The other thing is use of technology definitely is a really promising trend, particularly with mobile technology that reaches more people. There's data from the UN that says more people have access to mobile phones than bathrooms in the world. So there is a lot of promising trend where you can use mobile technology to provide more, to have a deeper reach into communities for education. And the third thing I would say is communities themselves, and particularly the youth. That's a really promising trend where they really understand that they can really focus on solving their own issues. And I think that's a very promising trend where we see that children are, when we think of leadership, it's not only looking at adults, but how children are becoming leaders within their communities as well.
Great. Well, thank you, guys. We could obviously keep talking to this incredible panel for a long time, but I want to open it up to those of you in the audience who may have your own questions for panelists. We have a mic set up right here, so please feel free to ask some questions or share some thoughts and comments. Go ahead, please.
I'm Bill Carter with Ashoka. I just wanted, reflecting on the U.S. experience of education, particularly access to the board, starting decades ago. Early the programs focused very heavily on making sure that the child who came to school early wanted to eat and have a meal. And now we have organizations, decades on organizations like Revolution Foods that are essentially taking over control of those food supply chains to make sure that these children in these schools have access to wide spectrum nutrition. We recognize that children don't have that. They really are operating at a cognitive disadvantage relative to their peers. I wondered if and how this issue has surfaced as a right, in one instance as essentially as a contextual issue in the case of Uganda, and just in the work you're doing in Sahara and Ethiopia, whether it comes up. Thank you.
Anyone want to take that first?
I think you're absolutely right. One of the challenges you face with particularly poor communities is when you're looking at a child coming to school, if they come in an empty stomach, then your entire day is shot. So that is a huge issue in Ethiopia as well. And I think with Seeds of Africa, what we do is we provide meals in our school. So children have breakfast and snack in the school when they come in every day. And when you look at doing that at a larger system, it's definitely a challenge to look at funding and being able to provide that at a larger scale. But it's definitely something that you have to focus on in order to really make a change, which is earlier I touched upon how when you look at a child coming into school to learn, you have to look at all the other issues they have and how do you kind of find ways to solve some of the issues that make learning a bit difficult for a child. So definitely.
Sure. Excuse me. I mean, I think what you're raising is critical. I am yet to come across the interpretation of the right to education in legal terms, specifically including the right to food, but it most definitely has prominence in policy. In South Africa, for example, we have always, in fact for a long time, sorry, not always, for a long time now, understood that the right to education and the way in which education is provided and the way in which learners are able to access that is dependent on socioeconomic circumstances, which usually affects nutrition levels of learners, among other things, home environments, etc., having an impact on how well a kid is actually able to concentrate in class, for example. I think something that's interesting that might just relate to an earlier point I was making about this question of privatization, the increased influence and intervention of private sector in schooling. Not to say that I'm putting a blanket, disagreement with the benefits of that, but I think that actually, the issue that you're raising is quite an interesting area in which there can be lots of progress made by including actual privatization or elements of private input into those aspects, which don't necessarily mean that you're now involving business in running a school. But you're involving business and business methods in a very essential aspect of the schooling environment. And I think that there's a lot that can actually be explored around that. Just to give you something else as an example and why it's actually made me think about that right now. In South Africa, The way in which education is funded is that it's funded from a national level. So there's a national education budget which is allocated down to the 9 provinces, which have then provincial education institutions. They then determine how it is that the education budget allocated to their particular province is actually used in a particular province. But as a separate thing to that, and so that's, sorry, what the effect of that is that one province may choose to prioritize textbooks over toilets, for example, at schools. But what the national government then also does is it provides conditional grants to those provinces, which is basically a separate allocation focusing on particular issues, one of which is actually school nutrition, which basically says to a province, you need to ensure that this money is only spent on providing nutrition to needy schools in your province, which whatever money is not spent must be returned to the national government, very different to everything else. And there's major problems in asking an education department, which already has all of these issues to deal with, to now also ensure that there's proper scholar transport, that there's proper nutrition and feeding in the schools, etc. So I think that if there's a way in which you can get private or business input into the running of those smaller aspects and allow the education department then to focus on the other equally important but key aspects in running the actual school, I think there's actually a lot of room for progress. But I'd say fundamentally nutrition is, of course, extremely important to ensuring proper schooling environments.
Great. Do you want to move on to another question, please?
I'm a new entrant in this space, and I was just wondering, since we're talking about the state of education in Africa, from everything that I've read and heard so far, there's a lot of innovation within the educational space, but it seems to me to be disjointed, there's a lot of different modes of innovation from different places that are having very high impact, but in sort of limited communities. And I'm wondering, is there evidence that aggregates all of this information, or that is, do we have access to disaggregated data that shows what impact we are having in the different places in Africa or across the continent, that we can then aggregate and say, yes, things are improving? And I'm asking from the perspective of a lot of the African governments now are moving from talking about access to talking about quality. Based on what?
Yeah, a good question. That's something Boris and I have talked a little bit about, so I'm going to throw that one to you first.
Yeah, I think sadly overall there isn't a huge availability of evidence, and I think we know about sort of secondary and youth entrepreneurship evidence, and there's some on youth entrepreneurship that there's a study in Liberia that ties sort of a youth entrepreneurship program to greater income. There's studies that say entrepreneurship training can lead to greater entrepreneurship. We're running our own randomized control trial, which I believe is the 3rd or 4th on youth programs in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think there is there's been in the last few years a recognition that there's a lack of kind of really rigorous evidence, and there seem to be a lot of studies en route. I know BRAC has been a leader in sort of building the evidence base for that, and I think that there's an emerging wave. But even we've had to build tools ourselves, just because a lot of tools aren't built for the context. So maybe applied in the West, but they can't be applied directly in the West. So I think there isn't a ton of information now, but there seems to be a big push right now towards a lot more research.
Jordan, do you have a perspective?
I think it would be great if that existed. I don't think there is enough kind of conversation, and it tends to be, a lot of times information is very localized, or the studies are very localized, and I think it would be hugely beneficial if there was more conversation even within countries, across countries, and even just in what Boris is saying, some the sharing of tools and methodology around evaluation. I think there's huge variance in that, which then also affects the quality of the data. So I think there is a big push around metrics and evaluation, but that tends to be happening more on an organizational level and less on a sector level, and not as much kind of conversation happening with that information. Like we do a lot of evaluation, and kind of our next step is to start to share that, but there isn't even a lot of avenue to do that. So I think it's a good point and something that should be noted and addressed.
Go ahead.
One other thing I'd add is I thought your question was going to lead here to the idea that there are all these different innovations, but none of them are going to scale. And I think that is a sort of another increasing conversation. We're part of a learning, sort of a Millions Learning working group at Brookings Institution around taking the scale, and there's kind of the idea is that there's no lack of innovation, there's a lack of scale. And I think personally one of the issues in that I see is funding, just funding that there's not funding that's committed over a long term towards building a repeatable solution to a scalable problem. The funding, a lot of funding in sub-Saharan Africa is very project based, which leads to a lot of design towards the funding without necessarily a continuous process to think about how do we build an innovation and then take it to scale, which takes tens of years.
Right, and it is a very different challenge, in fact. A couple hands up here in the back. Let's do the people in the back row and then the person about 4 rows down.
Thank you. My name is Bolahan Olubowale. I'm originally from Nigeria. My question can be viewed from different perspectives. Africa is going to be having one of the largest youthful populations in years to come. Already we are having a crisis of youth unemployment, youths who are inadequately trained, who are inadequately educated, who are not empowered by their government for some obvious reasons. How can we begin to view education from an holistic perspective vis-a-vis community development, women capacity development and empowerment, so that down the road, we don't have more failed states in Africa? The youths are adequately prepared for the future. The Commonwealth or the people is being used to advance their progress. Thank you.
Anyone want to take that one? Yeah. Okay.
That's a big question.
Right.
So, I guess for us, in the kind of said parts of these things, I think from our perspective, it's about looking at what skills do youth need to be successful in life and ensuring that education matches that. So most young people are going to start a business, they should be learning how to start a business in school. If financial literacy is an issue, young people should be learning financial literacy at school. If dealing with home poverty is an issue that young people face, there are lots of ways to address that without money. There's an organization in Paraguay, Foundation Paraguay, that's built a really good sort of poverty assessment tool, and we've built that into a little handbook that allows you to assess their poverty as red, yellow, or green. Green being good, being a good state of welfare. So there are things like organizing your trash in a separate location rather than dumping it around that students can learn in school. And so I think our fundamental belief is that education system is a hugely untapped resource towards development.
Right.
And for it to reach its full potential, it needs to be fully aligned to what young people are going to be doing after. And then I think then you can have a really transformational impact on preparing the next generation of youth to be able to be leaders and entrepreneurs against their problems.
Great. We just got the high sign that we have time for just one more question. So why don't we hear from the 2 folks who had their hands up, and then we'll let the panel. The woman with the red, and then.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I just have a question about curriculum. You all spoke a lot about sort of hands-on skills-based curriculum, but I'm wondering if you're focusing on culturally and historically appropriate curriculum, which puts African history and culture sort of at the root of curriculum, and also what are you seeing in regards to instruction being presented, both written and orally, in students' indigenous languages versus sort of a foreign language?
Great. And let's get the final question.
Yes, my question, but an observation that I'm from Botswana. I'm looking at the panel
gives me an impression that these are people from the private sectors, if I'm not mistaken. Now, this seems to answer the question.
Would you mind using the mic so we can hear you?
Yes, as I said, I'm Master Baipide from Botswana. I represent the Minister of Education. Now, it gives me an impression when I look at the list of the panelists that this is yet another thing we may not be saying, wherein we see an element of public-private partnerships in education. Now, in Botswana, we have developed a program wherein we want to partner with, or we are partnering with the private sectors. We have, to that extent, introduced and adopt a school program wherein some of the issues that you seem to be raising there are indications of what we may be doing or we would want to do, wherein the private sector comes in with the view to engage the government on improving the curriculum. I was impressed when I learned about the high quality but low cost private schools, because we have always seen the divergence there, where in private schools seem to be offering what we thought to be better education, but the prices were killing, and the public sector was kind of so public and very low. Otherwise, I had wanted to get it from you. If the government or the countries you represent, do we have in the Ministry of Education programs that are well established to suggest there is going to be public-private partnership in education?
Okay. Why don't we get, I know we're running out of time and have a full morning, so why don't we get one response to each question, the question about curriculum and then the question about public-private partnerships. Ati?
Yeah, I can take the one about curriculum. I think the way you do that, for example, with CEAS, what we do is we teach in 3 different languages. One is English, the other one is Amharic, which is the national language of Ethiopia, and Orominya, which is the local language. So that the students have the ability to learn in different languages. And the second thing is, in terms of providing, delivering curriculum, we look at the local mandated curriculum and find ways in which you can use the culture of where the child is to find examples. I'll give a very quick example. We had this project about teaching our students about nutrition, and what we did with that is we had like 25 students go to the market with their teacher, buy local materials, and learn what is protein or what is carbohydrate through looking at their traditional food and learn how to cook that. So there are different ways where you can deliver curriculum that is life-changing, because unless you teach a child to solve their own issues at a young age, leadership is, it starts at a very young age, where a child learns how to solve issues incrementally, and then as they become an adult, they can have leadership qualities that can actually have a much larger impact in their communities.
Thanks, Ati. Any parting thoughts on public-private partnerships?
Sure. I mean, in South Africa, there are examples which can be looked to of public-private partnerships, and in fact, it's become quite recently a new strategy adopted by the Education Department, actually very similar to something that you mentioned now, a kind of adopt-a-school approach. So again, like I was saying on the example of finding ways in which those public-private partnerships can facilitate the provision of particular resources and more efficiency in particular aspects of schooling in supply chain management systems, for example. I think that there's lots of potential and value in that. My caution around that is to be wary about allowing the public-private partnership to start to develop into a diversion of public funds for private, sometimes even for-profit institutions in what is ultimately a public good. That can sometimes be, I think, a very difficult thing to balance. But like I was saying earlier, I think there's lots of benefit to look at finding ways in which the private sector can be brought into supporting and capacitating government in running an effective public education system, but not in the way that diverts public funds away from and into the private sector for that purpose.
Thank you. Great. Wonderful. Thank you all so much for your thoughts, and thank you, audience, for your participation.
Thank you to Liz and the panel for your remarks. What I particularly enjoyed about this panel was hearing each of these young people share their specific business models on improving both the quality and accessibility of education on the continent of Africa, including community organizing, public sector partnerships, and teaching young people problem solving at an early age. So thank you very much.